we will be discussing matters that are of pertinence to you and your automobile. As always, we hope to impart to you some useful automotive information and perhaps provoke some automotive conversation on this kind of a cool, cloudy Earth Day. That's right, Earth Day. And we got lots of stuff to talk about today. And that's what we're going to start with. You know, today is the 47th Earth Day. This is the anniversary of the birth of modern environmentalism in this country. And I can remember the very first Earth Day because it was a big deal where I lived at the time, which was in New York City. And I was, I believe, in the 7th grade. And I was amazed by it because like about 1 million people showed up to have a protest. And I said, wow, what is this all about? And, of course, 1970 was kind of the height of the counterculture. That was when the Beatles made their last album, right? And Simon and Garfunkel was pretty popular. And, of course, the Vietnam War was not so popular. But, you know, back then, air pollution was commonly accepted as a smell of prosperity. In other words, that meant there was commerce going on and people were making money and people were working. So it's interesting if you think about it, how bad things were back then. And I think if you want to look at how bad things were, all you need to go look at is some other countries around the world today. But back then, we were slurping gas, guzzling it, I should say, driving giant cars. I mean, you go to car shows today and look at some of the size of those cars from late 60s and early 70s. They were houses on wheels. But they guzzled gas quite regularly. And, of course, we were, belching out pollution. And really, there wasn't very much in the way of fear of legal consequences or even bad press. Matter of fact, I think the word environment was something you probably heard more on a spelling bee question. Can you spell the word environment? I think that's probably where you heard the word more than anything else. But, things changed. And I think Earth Day in its original form, which is true to this day, really gave a lot of social consciousness to, why do we want to wreck our environment, which is a stupid idea. But again, we thought pollution was the smell of success. I really believe that that's how society saw things from the beginning of the industrial age right up through that point. I also think that the anti-war movement was so big back then, they kind of just took this on as an additional part of the movement. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so successful early, because you already had a group of people that had a problem with something, and they just said, hey, you know what, we should have a problem with this too. And interestingly, the idea for National Earth Day came from a guy named Gaylord Nelson, who was a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin. He saw a bad oil spill in about 1969 in Santa Barbara, which really got him thinking about energizing the public consciousness about air and water pollution, just like war protesters were really energizing public consciousness about the Vietnam War. And the reason we talk about this today, because it's important. I personally believe that we'd still be driving gasoline-guzzling cars and putting out lots of black smoke out of the back end of them if it wasn't for the beginning of the environmental movement and social consciousness of that. And I would also tell you that Earth Day was basically bipartisan. Another person in the media, or congressman rather, a guy named Pete Mikulski, who was Republican congressman, was the co-chair of this movement. So you had a bipartisan movement of two people who thought that we needed to do something, both elected officials, and then they recruited a third guy from Harvard, a guy named Dennis Hayes. Mr. Hayes put a staff together to promote events across the land, and that started on April 22nd. Now, the reason they picked April 22nd, which is interesting, is because it fell between spring break and final exams. It's a true story. That's why they picked that date. On that day, and I remember, again, being a kid in New York, but about 20 million people around this country took to the streets to start this movement. It was massive, and it'd be massive by today's standards, but 1970 standards, that was incredibly massive. And, ever since then, they've been fighting against oil spills, polluting factories, raw sewage. You go down the list of stuff, toxic dumps, pesticides. And basically, it became a common shared value for all of us that, you know what, they're right. You can't do this stuff. So really, the auto industry followed we'll just say, the will of society, the will of the public. And, of course, Mr. Hayes stuck around for many, many years, and it became a group led with a lot of people involved, which is really good about it, because if you think about it, it wasn't just rich people. It was people of all political stripes, rich, poor, city slickers, farmers, rich people involved with labor movement. Everybody saw the commonality of not having, basically not living in an environment that's unsafe and that you're actually damaging on a daily basis. And I think that by 1990, this country was pretty well entrenched with Earth Day, but it went global. And Dennis Hayes took the thing global to 141 countries. And as a matter of fact, Senator Nelson was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Clinton back in 1995 as his role as Earth Day founder. So, you know what? We could talk about environmental craziness where it goes too far in one direction, where perhaps some of the claims made are not exactly correct. But nobody wants to live in a dirty place, and I think that is the benefit of this. And as people that own cars, we're seeing the car industry say, "Hey, you know what? We don't want to make cars that are bad for the environment." Again, I believe that they do so today because they were forced to. But what's more interesting now is the hybrid cars and the electric cars that we're seeing being developed. Is not just a regulatory mandate. They're starting to see consumers' appetite for these products actually begin to pick up. In a study that AAA just did, we looked at, okay, do you really want an environmentally correct vehicle? Not something that's just efficient, but do you want something that really lowers your carbon footprint, so to speak? Now, we'll talk about gas prices later because they are going up, and we're not happy about that. But just for today's discussion, gas prices today are about 40% lower than they were 5 years ago. So if you go back to 5 years ago when we were hitting $4 a gallon, which nobody was very fond of, when we look at that, back then, people did not want to think about electric cars or hybrids when they're paying that much for gas because, you know what, they didn't have technology or believe that it could actually work. So now today, it's a different story. So what's interesting is even though we were enjoying lower prices than we were 5 years ago, and again, qualify that with they're going up right now, people now have a bigger appetite for these vehicles. And I think that's an interesting juxtaposition than just a few years ago. So when we look at who might consider buying one of these, well, our survey showed that consumer interest in electric vehicles is pretty high. As a matter of fact, more than 30 million of us are likely to consider buying an electric car for our next car. That's 30 million Americans. Now, that's not a small number, recognizing that's a little less than 10% of the population of the country. But that's a big number. If 30 million people are willing to give something a shot, well, the manufacturers look at that and say, hey, wait a minute, we've got something out there that maybe people want. So I think that bodes very, very well for the future of electric cars and plug-in hybrids, which, by the way, people like better than regular hybrids. Again, that's because they want to use the electricity, not the gasoline. Now, we'll save the discussion of where electricity comes from for another day, because that's another whole kettle of fish, as they say. But the bottom line is electric cars are gaining much more acceptance. And when we look at what people actually do with their cars every day, I think that is the key to this. And I believe it was driven because of the high gas prices. When we were hitting $4 a gallon, I could tell you that that people were driving far less. We saw this in our surveys and things that we look at AAA. So what happened was people didn't like electric cars because first of all, they thought they were slugs. They were too slow. And of course, Mr. Tesla, Elon Musk in a Tesla car actually took care of that. It's a very fast car. They showed that electric cars can be high performance. They also didn't believe that the range of these things were very, very good. And actually they weren't. But I think people's anxiety about range versus what they actually did every day weren't on the same curve. They more likely are now. For example, when we talk about who's afraid of electric cars, we talk about what you don't like about them. 69% of people believe there's not enough charging stations, which is somewhat true. And 68% of them believe it's going to run out of charge. Obviously, the higher purchase price and the battery replacement of the battery in the thing is also something that's concerning for people. But what's interesting is 72% of baby boomers are more concerned about running out of juice than millennials, about 62%. So older people are more worried about them running out of charge. What's interesting, a lot of older people are retired. So the question becomes, do they use their car more or not? Well, as we look at driving habits of people, the average American commutes 46 miles round trip with an average driving time of 31 minutes. Now, that's significant if you think about it, because when you talk about the range of electric cars, that's not an issue for any of them. If you have a 46-mile round trip, even the worst of them have over 100 miles of range. That's the worst of on the marketplace. So what you're seeing now is people are recognizing that what they actually do every day with a car, maybe this electric car idea actually works for them. And then that changes the paradigm of how they consider the vehicle. I kind of believe what you're going to see is in a multi-car family, you're going to see the daily driver that goes back and forth to work be an electric car, and they'll have the minivan or gasoline-powered vehicle for the weekends or for long trips. I think that'll be where this will go as time goes on. And, the price comes down. The price keeps coming down. The General Motors just released the Bolt, the B-O-L-T, and that vehicle is around $30,000, and it's a small car, but it's totally electric, and it's very mainstream. I'm hoping this winter I get to test one of these cars. I'm going to try to get myself one of these just to test, because I want to see how long the battery lasts at 20 below zero. That'll be the ED test. But for the last few years, we've talked about this. AAA has looked at the green cars, all of the cars, and to find out which is the greenest of the cars. And our research center in Southern California rates and ranks electric vehicles, hybrids, compressed natural gas vehicles, diesels. And they look at all these cars, and we put together a green guide every year. By the way, you can go to AAA.com/green card. You can see this online yourself.